I'm going to build a shot in After Effects using After Effects' 3D tools. The shot that I'm going to build is an intro or an ident for some kind of cooking video. I'm just going to run through the 4 seconds that I've got built, and you can see that we're looking at a collection of assets. They're positioned in 3D space, and the camera's kind of rotating across those objects, and we can see that they're all kind of offset, and there's also some shadows being cast in there. So this is a stripped back version of an ident that I created in the past. I'll give you a link to it. That's a little bit more detailed. Let's have a look at the PSD of the assets for this project and get into it. So I'm going to create a new project, and I'm going to import my assets, which I've whacked on the desktop, I think. Yep. Okay, here are our assets. I've imported them as a composition. Let's have a look at the composition and what we've got to work with. So a bunch of kind of Photoshop layers that I've contoured and they've got transparent backgrounds. We've got a bit of text here, and we've got a background layer in the background there. Just firstly, I might show you, this is some Photoshop text that I've brought through into After Effects. And when a text layer is kind of shown in the composition here, it seems to be uneditable, but I can actually either right-click on that and go down to Create and convert to editable text, or I can go up to Layer, Create, and convert to editable text, and that'll turn that into an After Effects text layer, and I can double click on that and change it if I want to. I'm not going to worry about doing that at the moment. Let's turn these objects into 3D objects, so we can start building up that kind of diorama. To do that, all we need to do is to turn on the 3D switch for each of the layers. So you can see here that I've got a little a 3D checkbox that I can add to each of these layers. You'll want to check that you've got the right columns showing here, and once I do have these correct checkboxes, I can just turn on all of those layers. So all of these layers here I want to kind of bring out in 3D space. So I'm going to turn those on and leave the background as it is. It's just a normal 2D layer in the background. You'll see up here that I've got a new little option that says Renderer, and I'm using the classic 3D renderer. So there's a couple of different renderers that you can use when you're working in 3D. Let's go and have a look at composition settings. Oops, here's our composition settings. Here's our basic settings and our 3D renderer settings. So I've got my renderer set to classic 3D. And the classic 3D is the traditional After Effects renderer. Layers can be positioned as planes in 3D space. That's kind of what I want to do with this project. However, there is another rendering engine that we can use, and that is the Cinema 4D rendering engine. So these two rendering engines exclusively, well, as of After Effects 2020, these are our two rendering engine options. Previously, we had the option to use the ray-traced 3D rendering option, but that's been removed in 2020 which I think is pretty unfortunate because I think it had some really good uses. So we're just going to look at the classic 3D in this video here. And I'm going to click OK. So we can access that from this tab here. I can just hit that and it will open up our rendering options, and we can toggle between the classic and the Cinema 4D. So if you are using any 3D models, for example, or you're using Cinema 4D, the Cinema 4D plugin, you'll need to use the Cinema 4D render engine. For this shot, the classic 3D is perfect. So we've got our 3D layers turned on, which means that we'll be able to look at our 3D space from a bunch of different angles. And if you look up here where we've got this active camera pull down option, we can look at the different kind of viewpoints of our workspace. So from the top, you can see all those elements there all set at 0 on Z space, so they're kind of all in line and they don't actually have any depth. If we look at it from the custom view, this might be like a view from a side. We can see all of our elements from that angle, from a kind of bird's eye angle. I'm going to select back the active camera. So this is our normal kind of viewpoint port, I suppose. I'm actually going to add a camera to the scene. So if I go up to Layer and New, one of the layers that I can add is a camera. So I'm going to add that to the scene. And I'm just going to use the default camera, which is a 50mm preset, and go OK. And so we can actually see here that we have a layer that is called camera 1. Obviously I can name that whatever I want. And then I can select that viewport, that main camera view from my options there. Awesome. Let's start manipulating our assets in 3D space. So if I just select the onion layer there and hit P on the keyboard for my position properties, you can see now that because I've got the 3D layer switch selected, I've got 3 values for position. So up and down and backwards and forwards. So we've got X, Y and Z space that we can manipulate our objects in. So I can move my onion left and right, up and down, but I can also bring it forward and backwards in Z space. And I'm just going to bring it kind of minus 200, I suppose, and then have a look at our scene from the top. And you can see now these are all of the other assets, and this is the onion assets, and you can see that it has been brought minus 227 pixels in Z space. You can see if I zoom in on my onion, you can see that we've got these handles, and these handles allow us to manipulate our asset in 3D space, and these handles are similar to other 3D workspaces. You might have used Adobe Dimension or maybe the 3D space inside of Photoshop. So the different color handles allow us to move the asset or the object or the layer around in the X plane, the Z plane, or up and down. You can't see that moving there in Y space. Let me just go back to the main camera view, and don't know what happened to the onion there. I'm going to need more space for our layers, I think. So the position property, I'm going to set that back to 0 and start kind of spacing out all of my elements. So I'm going to work from the chopping block and move everything away from the chopping block. So I'm going to start with the spoon and work my way through these layers and push them all closer to the camera by adding a negative property to the Z position value. So I might just twirl down all of the position properties so I can see all of the positions there. And we'll start with the spoon. And in the Z position property, I'm going to put -50. And you can see that spoon move in front of everything else. I'm going to move through my layers here just by adding more negative values. So now we've got the chopping board at 0, the spoon at -50, and the knife at -100, and those objects are coming closer to the camera. Oops, if we have a look at the top, you can see that there's the chopping board and everything else is moving closer. Let's have a look at this custom view. You can see everything's kind of moving towards the camera. So I'm going to quickly work through all of these assets and move them into position. I'm going to put those leaves on the same plane as the knife, I think, and the orange maybe 50 pixels further. Same with the carrots. And then the word itself, another 50 pixels forward. I could do this with my handles there, but sometimes it's easier just to use the numeric values. And then I'm going to put the onion right up in front, -3 pixels, and you can see that that's just ahead of the text there, which is pretty cool. So let's have a look at our top view. See, everything's kind of spaced out there in space. If I zoom right out, we should be able to see the camera here. So that's the camera's kind of maybe like a few thousand pixels away from the main action. Let's go back to our custom view. Kind of see that space in play, and back at our main camera view. Okay, so to kind of show or see that three-dimensionality, to see those elements in that Z space, I want to move the camera around, and we can do that by, let's just twirl up all of these properties and have a look at the position property for the camera. Let's have a look at all the properties for the camera. So we've got a point of interest. So that's the point at which the I don't know, camera is focused on. And then we've got our position, orientation, and then we've got 3 rotation values there. So let's just have a quick little play. I can move the camera up and down, and left and right, and you can see our assets kind of moving within the frame. We can actually manipulate these values or the camera's position by using the camera tool. If I select the camera tool and hit C on the keyboard, I can toggle through the different camera tools. This one here is the camera rotate tool. This one here is the, I suppose it's the tracking tool, or the pan left and right tool, and this one here is the track back and forward tool. So let's have a look at the orbit tool. So if I click and drag on the screen there, I can see I can orbit the camera around my focal point, but it keeps its kind of point of interest centered on the objects there. Just going to undo that. If I use the pan up and left and right tool, I can pan around that scene, and I can also track in and out of the kind of the main action there. For this animation, I'm going to simply do an orbit. I'm going to keyframe using the orbit tool. And let's just make this workspace a little bit smaller. 4 seconds worth of action I want to capture here. At 0, I'm going to add a point of interest keyframe. So I want to keep the point of interest static all the way through, so kind of looking at these objects here, but I want to change the position of my camera over time. So around about the 3-second mark, well, at 0, I'm going to use the orbit tool and kind of set up the position of my camera, kind of like that, and then move through time to about 3 seconds, and then I'm going to change the position of that camera to something like that. And then when I scroll through time, you can see that those assets which are kind of positioned in space, they're not moving, but the camera is actually moving, and it gives us that 3-dimensional effect, which is kind of cool. I might just quickly render that. And I'm going to put some ease on those keyframes. So that the camera will slow down as it moves towards that 3-second mark. Excellent. So we've positioned a bunch of assets in space. We've added a camera to this scene, and we've keyframed the camera moving across time. One last thing we're going to do is we're going to add a light to the scene. Oops. So that's another layer that we can add to the scene, a new light, and I'm going to add a spotlight. Okay, so a spotlight is a kind of a directional light. It's quite a harsh light. And once I've added that, you can see the effect that it's causing the scene and causing those objects. So to start with, the background layer here is not a 3-dimensional layer, so any 3-dimensional kind of attributes that you've applied to the scene won't affect that 2D layer. That's going to sit as is. But all of the other elements there you can see are being affected by that spotlight. You see the spotlight does have its own 3D kind of toggle points that I can manipulate in space. And I'm going to grab the red one here and move, no, actually it wasn't the red one that I wanted, the blue one, to move, because that's, see how it's got, once I've touched it, it's got the Z on it. That's going to allow me to move that light further away from the objects there. And could do that numerically, but you can see if I get closer, that spotlight is more like a pinpoint, and I move it further away. It's kind of going to open up and light the scene a little bit more broadly. Excellent. So you can see by default our 3D layers take the light on, but they don't automatically cast shadows. We've got no shadows in the scene. So to get shadows active in the scene, we need to do a couple of things. We need to firstly twirl down our light properties, go into our lighting options. There's a bunch of things that we can do in here. We can adjust the cone angle, so we can open up the cone angle or focus it more. We can feather that angle, but we can also turn on and off whether or not that light does cast shadows. Sometimes it's appropriate to cast shadows, sometimes you don't want shadows cast. And adding shadows to a scene does increase the rendering time quite significantly. And I suppose I should make the point that working in 3D at any kind of level does increase render times and processing power. So as soon as you add anything 3D into your workspace, you're going to see your rendering times go up and your wait times go up. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to turn cast shadows on for my light, and that's not going to do anything straight away, because inside of all of our the properties of each of our layers there, we do have, since we've got the 3D switch active, we've got what we call material options. And I might just twirl down the onion layer and show that. See, we've got our material options there. And under material options, each element, you need to decide whether or not that element casts a shadow. So if I turn that on, you can see that the light is now casting a shadow, or is projecting a shadow, and the asset itself is now casting that shadow onto objects behind it. So I'm going to go ahead and I might just turn that off. Oops. So we can actually toggle between no shadow, a shadow being cast, and only a shadow. That may or may not be helpful at times. So I'm going to turn it off because I want to add the I want all these objects to cast shadows. So I'm going to select them all, and I'm going to hit A twice in quick succession on the keyboard. And that's going to twirl down all the material options for all of those layers. And I'm going to turn on the cast shadow for all of those objects. There we go. So I thought that having all of them selected, it would do that, but apparently the onion didn't want to do that. But yes, I've cast shadows now for all of those objects. You can see as I scroll through the layers there, all of the cast shadows options is now on, and you can see that they are all indeed casting shadows to the objects behind there. So I'll twirl that all up. I think those shadows are looking a little bit heavy, so I can turn that down a bit by adjusting the spotlight itself a little bit. So let's get the material options for the light, and I can change the shadow darkness, just drop that down a little bit, maybe to about 35. And I can also add some diffusion to make that a little softer. So I think that, okay, so I think that's appropriately more subtle. So I'll just render that. And you can see my rendering time is yeah, much more significant with the shadows turned on. But you can see that each of those objects is casting a shadow onto the previous object. It's not casting a shadow onto the background because the background itself is not a 3D layer. Okay, so everything's in place and our ident is finished to a certain extent. And we've finished off the animation by adding a light to the scene, which adds a little bit more kind of depth and realism to a three-dimensional scene. Last thing I'm going to do, just to finalise this, is I'm going to take out the kitchen, or our typography here. I'm going to take that out of the shadow and turn off receiving shadows, so that stands out a little bit more. So where is it here? Accepts shadows is on. Okay, so you can see that it is kind of, you know, in the darkness there a little bit. I'm going to turn that off so that oops. Well, hang on, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to accepts lights is off. So it will cast a shadow, but it won't. The light itself won't affect it. You can see it's kind of popped out of the background a little bit more. All right, that's my video, an introduction to the 3D space in After Effects. Cheers.